Droughts and famine constitute some of the worst natural disasters in recorded history, wiping out large portions of the population in affected areas. And unlike most other natural disasters, droughts and famine can be man-made, the result of mismanagement of resources and the cruel policies of leaders. So, today we're going to take a look at the worst droughts and famines in modern history. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other historic natural disasters you would like to hear about. Okay, we hope you've worked up a thirst for some weird history, because here we go. Lingering economic problems from World War I, widespread drought, and 5 years of civil war resulted in a devastating famine that affected an estimated 30 million Russians throughout 1921. However, the famine had been building for years, and communist revolutionaries partially orchestrated the disaster for their own political gain. At the time, peasants and independent farmers were viewed as a threat to Russia's transition to communism. Starting in 1917, communist officials had been seizing food from the poor, with the intent to deliberately cause starvation. This made the natural causes of the famine even more devastating. Russian officials did little to intervene and adopted a policy of willfully letting peasants starve, because again, that was their goal all along. The resulting chaos led to reports of throughout the region, as well as outbreaks of cholera and typhus. Eventually, the Bolsheviks were forced to reach out to Western nations for help, which they super didn't want to do. So that tells you how serious the situation was. While much of the damage had already been done, outside forces managed to slow the progression of the famine and provide massive relief across the country. It's a stark and terrifying reminder of how far people will go for their politics, a theme you'll be seeing quite a bit in this episode. The Dust Bowl was a severe drought and food shortage that devastated the southern plains region of the United States throughout the 1930s, and also unleashed the grapes of wrath on several generations of middle school summer reading lists, which may be its most egregious offense. While the Dust Bowl was in part caused by natural environmental factors, human activity definitely played a role in worsening the disaster. In 1862, the Homestead Act, meant to encourage people to settle in the southern plains, gave settlers who migrated 160 acres of land. Land speculators and immigrants believed agriculture could affect the climate of the region, creating a rich environment for farming. However, this was not the case, and early settlers actually made conditions worse by plowing through native grassland in an unsuccessful attempt to grow crops. A severe drought in 1931 made conditions worse, resulting in dust storms sweeping the country. Dust blown from the southern plains was far-reaching. Areas like New York City and Washington, D.C. experienced dust blizzards, in which dust would darken the sky and infiltrate homes and buildings. And if you have ever tried to build a dust snowman, it's not as whimsical as it sounds. Additionally, many perished from dust pneumonia, a condition that caused difficulty breathing and chest pain. The Dust Bowl marked a major change in the demographics of the United States. Dust Bowl states, especially Oklahoma, lost thousands of residents as conditions worsened. Meanwhile, California received a massive influx of new people. The Dust Bowl migration remains the largest mass migration in United States history. Affecting primarily Ukraine, the Soviet famine of 1932 is remembered by some as the Holodomor, a term that translates to and not a character on Game of Thrones. Historians place the blame for the famine primarily on Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who was not exactly a man of the people. Stalin wanted to radically change the country, and as part of a cruel strategy, he decided Ukrainian farmers needed to be liquidated. Not a comforting word to hear from a dictator. First, he ordered everyone living in the Soviet countryside to adhere to a collectivist government structure. To eliminate any peasants selling food for profit, Soviet troops roamed throughout the Ukrainian countryside and seized crops from peasant populations. The intent was to deliberately start a famine and starve out the peasants. The results were devastating. Famine swept throughout Ukraine and millions perished. There were reports of peasants begging communist-run shops for bread and food, and to this day, Russia remains mute on this man-made famine, and Russia's treatment of Ukraine hasn't improved much. Russian officials have even outright denied the famine occurred, and it remains little known in the Western world, except for those clever enough to listen to Weird History. Can we get a little applause? Even though it is not widely acknowledged in China today, a 1942 drought and subsequent famine resulted in millions of lives lost between 1942 and 1943 in the province of Hunan. During that time, Japanese troops occupied most of the area, and when a drought swept through the region, the two factors affected crop production, leading to a massive famine and widespread death from starvation. Turns out an occupying force and a choking drought are bad for agriculture. At the time, China lacked the resources to effectively address the issue. Consequently, the results were nothing short of devastating. Journalists who traveled to China to report on the famine discovered people starving in the street. During the 1943 Bengal famine, India was still under British control. With World War II at its peak, the British government was exporting massive amounts of food from India to feed its own population. From January to July, India exported more than 70,000 tons of rice to Britain. Winston Churchill refused to export food to India in return, claiming a shortage of ships prevented him from doing so. It's unclear if this was true, but it does seem pretty convenient for the British. The result was a devastating famine, which some consider one of the greatest human rights violations India suffered as a result of British colonialism. Survivors later reported the effects of the famine in horrific detail. Eventually, the heavy exportation rate slowed, and Britain provided relief in November via shipments of barley and rice. Thankfully, these shipments managed to end the famine by the end of the year. China's Great Leap Forward was an economic campaign launched in 1958 with the goal of transforming the country from an agrarian economy into a more industrial, communist state. It was also the primary cause of the Great Chinese Famine, which despite its name was not so great for the people who suffered through it. The ordeal remains a controversial subject in China, and the Chinese government even bans most books regarding the famine. In a nutshell, during April of 1959, the Chinese population was forced to drop regular tasks, such as farming, and focused primarily on steel production in order to catch up with the United States and Britain. As a result, food became extremely scarce. Predictably, the peasant population was hit the hardest. Many families were left with virtually nothing to eat. Widely televised throughout the West in the 1980s, and spawning celebrity charity songs like "Do They Know It's Christmas?" and "We Are the World," the Ethiopian famine of 1984 and 85 put 5 million people at risk of starvation. But it actually began in 1981, when a severe drought wiped out crops. As a result, the 1984 harvest did not yield nearly enough crops to feed the population, and famine quickly took hold, exacerbated by the effects of a decades-long civil war. Despite pictures of starving children being circulated throughout the world, affluent Western nations were slow to intervene due to the country's controversial government. Eventually, relief and aid agencies worldwide began putting pressure on various Western nations, in particular the United Kingdom, to help the ailing country. International aid began to flow in, and independent charities also raised money to help Ethiopia. By 1985, conditions began to improve, and the famine's worst effects were over. Unfortunately, the world still feels the effects of "Do They Know It's Christmas?" every holiday season. The famine that swept through North Korea during the 1990s remains enigmatic. Due to the isolated nature of the country, worldwide knowledge of what occurred is limited, and North Korea itself has never publicly acknowledged the disaster. Classic North Korea. The precise cause, dates, and number of lives lost are unknown, but reports of starving people roaming North Korean streets surfaced throughout the 1990s. It's likely that the famine's roots go back to 1948, when the country was founded. North Korea's farmland and climate are not ideal for crop production, so the country heavily relied upon food imported from the Soviet Union. However, the fall of the Soviet Union drastically reduced North Korea's access to those cheap and reliable resources. Furthermore, the country, founded in the spirit of complete self-reliance, largely refused any outside help. This, along with the flooding caused by warm weather patterns, drastically reduced food supplies. Eventually, North Korea relented and requested food aid from the international community, which somewhat alleviated the famine. However, North Korea continues to rely on international aid to feed their citizens to this day. Estimates of the famine's casualties range from hundreds of thousands of lives lost to between 1 and 3 million. The effects of the 2006 drought in Syria are still ongoing, making the number of lives lost difficult to tabulate. Scientists state that climate change was a major cause, along with natural fluctuations in temperature and unsustainable farming practices. That being said, recent studies indicate a strong link between worldwide changing temperatures and Syrian water shortages. The Syrian drought was a major contributing factor to the political turmoil in Syria. Many rural Syrians, left without food and other resources, traveled to cities in search of food. This occurred just after millions of refugees fleeing the Iraq War caused a huge population shock in 2006. The stress contributed to Bashar al-Assad's 2011 uprising and the subsequent civil war that has devastated the country. A severe drought in 2011 led to a famine throughout East Africa, primarily affecting Somalia. An estimated 260,000 people perished, and not just because of the famine conditions. Aid from Western countries was slow to arrive, due in part to the fact that the militant Islamist group Al-Shabaab, which has ties to Al-Qaeda, was in control of Somalia at the time. Al-Shabaab denied the famine and banned all Western aid, allowing the famine to spread to other areas. While aid eventually did arrive, and the famine officially ended in 2012, the slow response allowed the famine to spread throughout Eastern Africa, exacerbating the death toll. While there were no lives lost, the 2014 Spanish drought had frightening implications for the future. During the worst drought in over 150 years, Spain saw its rainfall reach just 25% of average levels in some major cities. Water reservoirs depleted dramatically. While reservoirs are usually at 70 to 90% capacity, one major reservoir fell down to just 54%. Whether you're a reservoir half full or a reservoir half empty kind of person, that's a little low for comfort. Due to a changing climate, the future of the region is uncertain, but many scientists are predicting worse droughts to come. For instance, the American Southwest is currently experiencing a 20-year drought that is the driest in 1,200 years. In other words, it might be time to invest in evian. So what do you think? Which of these disasters do you think was the most severe? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.